right, you loyal and courageous Herle Burly-ites. A timely and important pod today with a very special guest. The kind of guest you don't make suffer through gratuitous references to your favorite snack foods and your own good press. So I'll get right to it. The Honourable Rachel Notley is here. Ms. Notley, as you know, served as the 17th Premier of Alberta and is currently a member of the Legislative Assembly for Edmonton-Strathcona and leader of the opposition, the Alberta New Democratic Party. A lawyer before entering politics, focusing on labor law and workers' rights, she was first elected in 2008 and won the leadership of her party in 2014 on the first ballot with 70% of the vote. And that impresses everybody but me, who got 93 for Paul Martin. Ms. Notley then went on to win a majority government in the 2015 provincial election, ending 44 years of continuous rule by the Progressive Conservatives. Thrilled to have her on the show. Here's where I'd like to take this today. I want to get Ms. Notley's assessment of the current UCP government under Danielle Smith. I want to get her take on the health accord and what should happen with healthcare writ large. I want to talk about what's right and fair with respect to energy policy. Maybe we'll get to the State of the Federation, and we're definitely going to talk about the path to victory for Ms. Notley and the NDP in the next provincial election. Rachel, thanks for taking the time for us on the Herle Burly today. Super excited that you could be here with us.
Good to be here.
Well, I got to start by saying I presume that tourism is really down in Alberta these days because of that fungus you've got that turns people into zombies. I've been seeing reports of this on the news, and it looks really nightmarish out there.
It's just around the legislature that you notice blew up in the second episode. But you get into the mountains, it's almost zombie free. You can
really?
Kilometer after kilometer without seeing a zombie.
Okay,
a bear you're going to be compelled to deal with, but not a zombie.
Are there some strip mine coal mines there that I can hide in from the zombies in the mountains?
Well, if we're not careful, they may reproduce, I will say.
So I'd like to start by getting a little sense of you and your background. Can you talk to me about where you grew up? And I mean, I know a lot about your dad because I was living in Saskatchewan at the time that he was NDP leader and he was such a star. I know a little bit about your dad. I don't know anything about your mom. So tell us how you grew up.
Well, I was born in Edmonton, and we lived in Edmonton till I was in grade 1. And then we all picked up and we moved to Fairview, which for your listeners is about a 6.5-hour drive north of Edmonton. And a little town of about
That's north.
That's quite north. It's pretty north. It's the northernmost wheat growing area in the world. Actually, we were very good at coming up with we've got the most of this and that things, and that was one of them. Anyway, so I grew up there, and my mom was there too. And you asked about my mom. She actually was American and had moved to Alberta in the early '60s and met my dad while she was volunteering for the party, and then the two of them got married, and so she decided to stay. But she came from a very, she was one of those. She did voter registration in the early '60s in the southern states, and was very involved with politics, Democrat politics in the early '60s. Anyway,
why did she come to Canada?
Pardon me?
Why did she come to Canada?
I think she just was looking for a bit of change, a bit of just to try something new. And I don't think she'd planned to stay for very long necessarily, but then she met my dad and then did. So,
cool.
So that's kind of how that worked. And, so then, but interesting because she was raised just outside of Boston. So you can imagine finding herself, living in Fairview, Alberta, town of 2,000 people, 6.5 hours north of Edmonton. There was a little bit of culture shock there. I spent most of my life trying to, navigate, the community for her so that, every now and then pointing out to her that she was needed to chill out on some of her expectations. Anywho, but so that's the background, and of course my dad was leader, and he spent most of his time doing that, and then I went to school at Grand Prairie College. I au paired for a year in Paris, and then went to school at Grand Prairie College, and then ultimately finished at U of A, and then went to Osgoode for my law degree, and then moved back home because I will say, as much as it was fun, I made some good friends in Toronto living out there for law school. I very much miss the prairie the sun, the dry cold. It really is a thing. Moved back home.
It is. Yeah. It is. It's very cool. How old were you when your dad died?
I was 20.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Do you have a sibling who is a rabid right-winger?
No, I do not.
Oh, okay. Because sometimes, you get the rebellious one, right? So you've got these two obviously left-wing activist parents, and you fell right in line with that. I thought maybe you had somebody out there that was, organizing for Trump down in Oklahoma or something.
Good Lord, no. I have one sibling who's like he's a tutor and is a historian, and he studies right wingers. It's funny. So he actually historian studies the sort of the rise of right wing thought, mostly in the U.S. And then my other brother lives down in the U.S. and he's a video game producer and also draws his own comic. Periodically is featured at Comic-Con down in San Francisco. Oh, yeah. It's a professional nerd, 18 going on 50.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a friend like that, Scott Reed. He's on one of my other shows. He's a Comic-Con guy for sure.
I bet you they know each other. Yeah, Bobby and the Flower is my brother Steven's comic. You can look it up.
Excellent, yeah. I will for sure. I told you I'm from Saskatchewan, but I live in Toronto now. So I'll just tell you down here, we hear a lot about Alberta political scandals and controversies and seemingly out of the mainstream things that people might say. But we don't actually hear a lot about Alberta. Can I ask you to give us a little bit of a State of the Union? Like, what is going well and badly in Alberta right now? How's the province doing?
Well, listen, Alberta's been through a lot since about 2014, and I don't necessarily attribute, our government as being part of that, but the price of oil collapsed in 2014, and there was a point at which it was trading at around $23, $24 a barrel, and it was probably the biggest collapse and crisis that the province had seen in many, many decades. And so that was obviously very, very destabilizing. And although the price of oil has recovered, the industry as a whole did not recover in the same way. It didn't hire back all the people that had been there before. It had adopted a incredibly large number of efficiencies, and in so doing chose not to hire back. So a drill that used to take 30 people now requires 3, and so that happened. And then of course we then got into COVID, and then there was a further collapse in the price of oil for a very short period of time. It's been tough. Now, that being said, Alberta's pretty resilient, and we still economically we do jump back. It's just that there's a real feeling of loss relative to where things were, and I think that that's hard for folks. But other things about Alberta that people won't necessarily realize is that we are the youngest province in the country. We're the best educated province in the country, and we are one of the most diverse provinces in the country. People are unaware, Calgary is probably the second or third most ethnically diverse city in the country. And in part because of the prosperity that we had, people emigrated here. And so it makes for, we've got a lot of multiculturalism and a lot of respect for the arts and all that kind of stuff. So that's there. And then I would say, as a homegrown Albertan who spent, 3 years in Toronto defending Alberta to my law school colleagues, and then another 8 years in Vancouver and Victoria defending Alberta to my NDP colleagues out there, the sun shines here a lot. People are very friendly and very outgoing and a lot of fun. And, people who come here from other parts of the country are often taken aback by that.
Well, as a federal Liberal, I've tested that hospitality at times, I'll tell you.
Well, yeah. I'm talking generally. I'm not talking politics right now. I'm just talking about you go into a bar and you sit down and start talking to a stranger. I'm telling you, you'll have a good experience.
Until you tell them you like Trudeau.
Exactly. Then things will change.
Then it's going to go sideways.
Yep.
So where is, I mean, like, at some level, I don't know where to start with Danielle Smith, but let's depersonalize it a little bit and just say, this is a one-term government. It seems like it's been there for 30 years because of all the shit that's gone on, but it's a one-term government. And with all due respect, most of the times one-term governments get a second chance. What is the case for change?
The change from Danielle Smith's government.
Yeah, why should they be defeated? Why should she be defeated in the next election?
Well, I think basically at the highest level, the issue here is that she just has the wrong priorities. She's just not focused on doing the work that a leader of the province should be doing to improve the state of things in the areas that she should be focused on. So more generally speaking, I mean, she's not interested in good public health care. She's not interested in, the evidence that would support how to get there. She just isn't. And by she, I mean she and the UCP. They're not focused on making some of the sort of long-term decisions that will help with affordability issues. And they're also not sort of focused on growing the economy. Meanwhile, you've got sort of strange priorities where she's literally jeopardizing the economic security of hundreds and hundreds of thousands of older Albertans when it comes to, Canada Pension Plan, solely so she can poke Justin Trudeau in the eye. And that's ridiculous. We've got them threatening to fire the RCMP, creating huge amount of instability in communities around the province solely so she can poke Justin Trudeau in the eye. Like, that's not how you make decisions. Make decisions about what's best for folks based on the priorities that they tell you to work on. And these are not the priorities that Albertans are telling her to work on.
Yeah, it sounds like a very ideological agenda, not a very practical agenda.
No, it's neither practical nor responsive to the people she owes a duty to.
Right. What's happened to the Kenney policy agenda, in the sense that, I remember even before all the stuff that happened with COVID in Alberta, that he had a lot of very controversial, if not out and out unpopular policies, whether it was the strip mining for coal in the Rockies that I referred to, or whether it was some hugely controversial education reforms. Does she skate from all that, or is that part of the record too?
I think it's still very much part of the record. I think she's actually been on record stating the fact that she's open to reconsidering the decision on coal. And by reconsidering, that means so basically, Kenney wanted to mine the mountains. Massive pushback from people, particularly coming from Calgary, which was originally their stronghold.
It took Corb Lund, I heard.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, people like and Corb people from Calgary and Corb and a few others too. And so they pushed pause on that, but she's actually toyed with the idea of unpausing the pause. Right. So that's still alive and well. Obviously, she's done nothing to help or to stop the chaos in our education system as it relates to the curriculum, and healthcare. This government, taking into account population and inflation, has pulled $1.7 billion out of our healthcare system. And she shows no signs of wanting to change that, except to sprinkle a little bit of money in order to start training people to pay out of pocket, and she's speculating about having people pay for family doctors. So that's new. That's an anti-healthcare piece that goes above and beyond Jason Kenney's agenda. But really, there's not a lot of divergence. There were the getting rid of the pension plan, the pulling out of the RCMP stuff that started with Jason Kenney, and she's just grabbed onto it and is carrying on with a great deal of passion.
What, by God, is the argument for getting out of the Canada Pension Plan? Good people of good faith can quarrel about the RCMP's capacity as a police force, but the CPP seems to me beyond the pale.
It's about pretending you're Quebec and poking Justin Trudeau in the eye, and jeopardizing people's entire security in the long term. Now, obviously, that's not the argument they're making, but that is the reality of what it will be. I think they claim that somehow Alberta, as a smaller fund and a smaller entity, can go into the market and make more money than the people who do investments for a Canada pension plan, which is dumb. But they argue that because Canada or Alberta is younger, we're somehow getting the short end of the stick on it. But anyway, it really is incredibly destabilizing and also just stupid idea, and we're very much opposed to it. And so too, and this is the thing about them being so ideological, over and over and over again, poll after poll after poll has shown that a minimum of 2/3 of Albertans are opposed to this, and they won't stop talking about it.
Well, good for you. Good for you. Yeah. Well, you know what they say about pension funds: the smaller, the better. So since you brought up health, no one ever says that. Floods, wildfires, atmospheric rivers, tornadoes, the pandemic. Not the cheeriest way to start a story, I grant you, but all too viscerally part of our collective consciousness these past few years. We've been talking here about our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and their commitment to network resilience and reliability. It's a cultural thing with them. Embedded in that culture is a thing called an EMOC. EMOC stands for Emergency Management Operations Committee. It's a group of 60 people over at TELUS, and while committee assignments in some settings are places where action goes to die, the EMOC is just the opposite. When a large threat to safety and connectivity is imminent and critical resources are required, the EMOC springs into action for rapid response and recovery. In a crisis, they meet twice daily to assess the situation and, working with community leaders, build critical plans to restore network service and connectivity and manage safety. Beyond the wires and cell sites, the TELUS team also provides humanitarian relief, evacuation centers equipped with Wi-Fi, food delivery to isolated communities, virtual healthcare services, funds and fundraising drives to help with relief efforts, cleanup of affected areas, and more, as each situation requires. Internally, their own people refer to the EMOC as the Wayne Gretzky of emergency response. And, lest you think that's a gratuitous label, Herle Burly-ites, like Gretzky for hockey, the EMOC has won just about every award imaginable for their recovery and relief efforts. I'd list them, but we'd be here for a while. Obviously, they don't do it for awards, but TELUS has a right to feel proud of their commitment to resilience and reliability. Whether it's billion-dollar investments in operational technology or people going way beyond to help other people stay connected in the direst conditions. More on this next week. Since you brought up healthcare, let's talk about that a little bit. So if they've been reducing funding on a real basis over time, why would they do that? Like, how could that possibly be in the interest of a provincial government to be deliberately reducing the quality of care in healthcare, given how politically potent that is?
Well, I think
what are they trying to accomplish?
Two things. First of all, healthcare has grown in its political potence in Alberta over the course of the last 4 years. I will say that I think we know, because, obviously we were in government, we polled like people in government do. In 2019, if you ask people what was a priority for them, healthcare was very low. So was education. I would argue the reason for that was because we had done a good job of stabilizing it and starting to make progress in terms of improving the quality of care people received. And they trusted the work that we were doing. And so they weren't super animated about its future because things were working okay. Over the course of the last 4 years, both because the UCP have dithered around and played around with it and really attacked healthcare on a number of different fronts. And then, of course, because of COVID, and then because of the subsequent crisis in care arising from so many folks, healthcare professionals leaving the industry, now people are very concerned about it, and these folks are on the wrong side of it. Ultimately, the reason they attacked it was because they like small government and they hate any place where people come together to be greater than the sum of their parts, and healthcare is the quintessential example of that. This is a very, very extreme right-wing group of people, and they want to break down healthcare, and healthcare is expensive. So they were very definitively on the track to train Albertans to stop relying on public health care. And that's the path they were on. And then, of course, it blew up with COVID, but they're, now they've just got a mess.
Do you think it's part of a plan to create a deliberate crisis that private involvement is seemingly the answer?
I absolutely think that is a part of what they're trying to do. And it's not just in Alberta that's happening, but it's very aggressively happening in Alberta that they think that people will get so frustrated, they will actually start encouraging them to go south and pay for healthcare and all that kind of stuff. So to go back to your original question about, why they shouldn't be in government, we are putting out a range of proposals to actually fix healthcare. So it's one thing to critique and highlight the stories of challenges that Albertans are experiencing, which we do in our role as opposition. But we are also going to be rolling out a very comprehensive plan, including later this week, we're going to be rolling out a plan to significantly scale up family health teams across the province, with the goal of being able to invite 1 million more Albertans into family care teams and clinics, so that they can get that care up front rather than having to run to the ER when they haven't been able to get that care elsewhere.
Yeah, because anybody defending Medicare now has to have a positive story about change, because the status quo is not an argument that works very well.
That is quite true. So we are very, very focused on that, and that should be contrasted with what we hear from Danielle Smith, who is literally musing about getting people to pay out of pocket for doctor's visits. So we have whole communities like, the city of Lethbridge, 40,000 people do not have a doctor. The city of Red Deer, not a single doctor is taking new patients. The whole Bow Valley corridor, which includes Banff, Canmore, and all the areas in between, nobody is taking new patients. So there is a crisis in family health. And what's Danielle Smith's response? Well, what about if you pay out of pocket for a doctor? So not that would actually help, but because most family doctors that I run into are completely uninterested in that model. But either way, they're just, again, wrong path, wrong priorities.
What'd you think of the agreement between the federal government and the provinces? I guess it's an agreement as of yesterday because the provinces all said they're fine with it. Smith seems to have no problem with it. What do you think about it?
Well, it's underwhelming. I'll be quite honest. I think that what COVID's taught us is that there is a need for some qualitative shifts in healthcare provision in Canada. So obviously, there's been talk about dental care. There's been talk about pharmacare. One of the things that sometimes gets lost, which shouldn't, because it was the location of so much tragedy during COVID, which is seniors
long-term care,
and long-term care. And all of those are things that are not currently appropriately funded through our healthcare. And so there needs to be some qualitative changes there. When we look at the challenge that I was just talking about, access to family care and family medicine, and the kind of qualitative change and systematic change that we're proposing to roll out here in Alberta, that too, by transitioning to that new model of delivery, in the long term, it may be a money saver, but in the short term, there's some upfront costs. And so what I see the federal government offered doing is it is primarily business as usual. It's basically the indexation formula, all that kind of stuff is status quo. And so that doesn't allow for a lot of provinces to really roll up their sleeves and start making those big changes that will help in the long term, not only maintain this, or ensure the stability of public health care, but also ultimately make it better. And I think probably reduce the costs in the longer term, or reduce the rate of increase.
It was you must have over the years talked with Trudeau about healthcare from time to time. Were you surprised that he now evinces no opinion about how healthcare is delivered?
I was a little surprised by that, because that did not seem to be the sort of the common set of values that we saw coming from this particular Liberal government. I mean, Liberal governments, as you know, have waxed and waned over the years on these issues, and they've been not always as consistent, but this one historically has been a bit better on those issues. But, it is an issue. It is an issue. And, I was listening to a conversation the other day where someone tried to frame the discussion about public delivery versus private delivery as a so-called ideological or political debate. And I would say that that's incorrect. I would say that it is actually that the commitment to publicly funded healthcare is the ideological and political debate, and it is one that I will wrap myself in with great pride and never back down from. The issue of public delivery, though, is actually a pragmatic conversation, because the evidence is there over and over and over in so many different settings that public delivery is the most efficient and the most effective and the most cost effective in terms of ensuring access, quality, and sustainability. So it doesn't mean that I'm not open to seeing a model. If someone wants to provide a different model to me and show me how we get around what has been the sort of very clear demonstration of the barriers to successful private delivery, then I'm happy to have somebody walk me through that. But there's just so many examples. I mean, in Alberta here, and you asked about Alberta, and it's an interesting case study that not maybe people would know about outside of Alberta, but in the mid 2000s, when there was a lot of a lot of concern around wait lists around hip and knee surgeries. The Regional Health Authority around Edmonton developed a specialized clinic for hip and knee that was publicly delivered. The Regional Health Authority in Calgary developed a specialized clinic for hip and knee that was privately delivered. The wait times were reduced dramatically in Edmonton. So we used some innovative ideas for sure, specialization, still within the public system, still publicly delivered. In Calgary, it ultimately went bankrupt and had to be bailed out by the public system, and the wait times were not reduced in any kind of long-term way. So there's an example, So you've got a clear case study of what we're like. So yeah, you're incorporating innovative ideas into the public system. Always do that. Never let the public system tell you it can't be done that way. Always be innovative. Always push for results, but the public system will always ensure accountability, and it won't be looking for the profit margin. And so, on average, it's going to do better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I had a...
The other thing is just pulling back from that, just to talk to sort of regular folks in the middle of an affordability crisis, which is quite frankly paralyzing everyone across the country. People should not be having to think about how much healthcare they have to budget for in any given month. And that's what we need to move away from.
Unbelievable. Never, for 50 years we've known that.
Yeah.
I had a guy in this pod named Greg Marshallton, who was the head of the Romano Commission. He said something really important to me. He said the principle has always been that the next procedure goes to the person who needs it the most.
Right. Yep. And that should not ever be undermined. And in fact, that principle does actually get compromised when you move to systems of private delivery, even where it's publicly funded.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. So, in the past year, our sponsor CN has implemented a policy of radical simplicity. Trains leave on time, period. All trains leave all stations on time. Okay, maybe it's not so simple. From coast to coast in Canada and down to the Gulf of Mexico, thousands of CN railroaders have to make sure tracks are clear, gears are meshing, and everything is running on schedule everywhere. To their enormous credit, that's what they've done. And here's what that has meant to one of CN's oldest and most important customers, Canada's grain farmers. This past October, CN moved more grain than in any other month of its 100-year history. November was just shy of an all-time record. December and January saw the same kind of performance. Network velocity, the measure of an average number of miles traveled per day per car, hasn't been as good in years. We are now halfway through the grain season. The Canadian winter has been, well, the Canadian winter. But farmers are getting their grain to markets in Canada and overseas on schedule. After the drought and disastrous weather of last season, this year has been something between a relief and a pleasure. To be clear, CN railroaders have had a lot of help. Grain farmers, shipping companies, country grain elevators, and the people who run the export terminals at Canada's major ports all worked in sync. And that, of course, is the key. Our supply chains don't need more government regulation. They need cooperation from origin to destination. And, of course, trains that leave the station on time. All right. Well, if that was an easy topic for you, let's move to something even more challenging. I really want to lean on you for guidance here. I'm being genuine about this. On the topic, probably Canada's thorniest dilemma, climate and energy policy. Right? Mm-hmm. And I say I look to you for guidance because I know you to be a person who recognizes climate change to be the problem for the planet that it is. Mm-hmm. And I also know you to be a person who, having been Premier of Alberta, knows what the economic reality of oil and gas is to Alberta and to Canada. Mm-hmm. Not just to Alberta, but to Canada.
Absolutely to Canada, yeah.
So take a bit of time here, if you would, and talk to me about what a fair and reasonable approach to energy and climate policy would be in Canada. And don't feel constrained by what it currently is. Like, what do you think we should be doing?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of elements to it, for sure. There's a lot of elements. But I think, let me start from the position that, I think along with the vast majority of Canadians and Albertans believe that we have to reduce emissions. We have to reduce emissions. We have to reduce emissions in our daily lives. We have to reduce emissions in our industrial processes. We have to reduce emissions worldwide. And so that's our starting point. Within oil and gas, we also need to reduce emissions and very significantly. But I do not believe that we are in a position of saying, so therefore we're going to stop producing oil and gas in the near term. And that's not the model. I think the model has to be that we push, we use both carrot and stick, quite frankly, to get producers to reduce the emissions in every barrel produced. I also think as Albertans that we have the opportunity to look at the products from oil and gas and look about at the degree to which we can actually change the product so that we're still utilizing the industrial capacity of what we have as a resource here in Alberta. And as you rightly point out, it has huge consequences for the economy of Canada as a whole. So you look at things like, bitumen beyond combustion, products that can be secured from the resource that don't even involve combustion. You look at hydrogen, which is a different way of using natural gas. You look at natural gas as an alternative to other forms of non-renewable energy. So I think that as an overall frame, I don't have a problem with a cap on emissions. I do have a problem with a cap on emissions that is not realistic and has not been established in consultation with the people who produce that product. And I mean, not just producers, but also the citizens of Alberta. I think that the current cap is not realistic that's being proposed by the federal government. But I do think that it's possible to get to a cap that is very ambitious, that we can get to, that's not super far away from that current cap. You know what I mean? So I think that there needs to be a practical path, and I think that we can make real progress. I just think that we have to really roll up our sleeves and get at the table and hammer it out in a very serious way. And then, it's that old adage, everyone leaves the table unhappy. That's great. What we're dealing with right now from Ottawa is an aspirational goal that's not really designed to achieve that pragmatic, practical, measurable outcome. And so there's a lot of daylight then between those of us who are more familiar with the industry and the jobs it creates and the economic growth it drives, and those who are, perhaps a little bit further away. Right. So I see as a whole this drive to reduce emissions in oil and gas as an opportunity, not as a penalty. And I think what we need to do is look at the investments that are required to reduce emissions in every barrel, and then understand that itself is not just ancillary to that production, but also becomes an economic driver and an export product in and of itself. And so I think in the long term, what we should be looking at is an industrial strategy that anticipates a growth in jobs in the sector, but the sector is doing things differently.
Interesting. Okay. So I had, just to put a counter argument, I had Brad Wall on this show, former Premier of Saskatchewan, Brad Wall. Yeah. And he put the counter argument to me perhaps as cleverly as it's ever been put. So I'll throw it back at you. Okay. He said, his argument was essentially this, and Premier Wall, forgive me if I get this in any way wrong as I try to paraphrase you, but basically what he was saying is that Canada's share of global emissions is tiny and inconsequential to global emissions. And that rather than putting our own economy, and particularly Alberta's economy, into the tank in an attempt to reduce that tiny share of emissions, we should be using our oil and gas wealth to help countries that really produce emissions reduce their emissions. So, right, supplying technology, whether it be nuclear or otherwise, to India and these kind of places, and using the wealth that oil and gas generates to do that. He said, my complaint about Trudeau isn't that his climate change plan is too ambitious. It's that it's not ambitious enough. What's your response to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's I think that's a convenient argument, and it's a way to help yourself sleep at night for doing nothing. So I don't think that's responsible. But even saying that, let me just let me qualify that a bit, because I think there is a little bit of overlap there. So for instance, and I mentioned already, hydrogen, I talked about, well, even more importantly, like LNG, for instance. To some degree, there is overlap between, I hate to say it, it's shocking to me, Brad Wall and I on this front, in that, yes, we have the capacity to produce a lot of LNG, and obviously LNG going to certain markets that currently rely on coal, that is a super big win. It's a super big win. Coal is the worst product, and we must eliminate coal from every industrial profile in the world, and LNG is a way that we can do that. So in that sense, I do there's some overlap between me and Brad Wall, but I don't think that lets us off the hook for what we need to do here, both domestically as well as in terms of what we do as far as our production, as well as what we're doing with respect to traditional conventional oil and gas. We can reduce emissions from conventional oil and gas so that when we do export it and it burns, we've reduced emissions in terms of how it's produced, and we've also reduced emissions in terms of what happens when it burns. And those are things that we can and should be working on. And we may be small, but we have the capacity to show leadership and to also develop the path and the tools that will help other jurisdictions show the same leadership. And so we should do that. And, that argument, if that argument were allowed to have won the day, we would never have moved on coal, and we would never have moved on renewable energy. When we first came into government, there was almost no renewable energy investment happening in this province, and it was all coal. We made the decision, we legislated that we were going to phase out of coal by 2030. In fact, it ended up happening much faster. We came up with a very innovative incentive program to attract investment in renewable energy to Alberta. We became the hottest renewable energy market in the country and in the continent. And ultimately, these guys don't like to admit it, but the plan we came up with, it was a subsidy. It was designed to be a subsidy, an efficient subsidy, but still a subsidy. It's actually making money now. There's actually net money going back into government coffers as we grow our wind and solar in Alberta. So these were not, if we could do it in 3 years or in 4 years, it couldn't possibly have been that complicated, right? So that argument that someone like Brad Wall makes would put up a blockade to all that kind of work, which is so important in positioning us going forward. And at the end of the day, markets are going to demand that we provide a better product and that we show that we're taking this seriously, international markets. And so we should be ready for when that happens.
Yeah, people that understand the economy tell me that that's what conservative politicians aren't understanding about the oil and gas, but that probably the industry does understand, which is it becomes very difficult to attract investment if you're a high-intensity outputter, because all these investment funds now have targets they have to meet. So
that's absolutely true. Yeah, no. So that's what I'm saying. So markets and investors are going to demand that we do better, and the uncertainty around the demand that the world will impose upon us with respect to emissions reduction will also undermine that investment. So if we don't create a thoughtful framework for those investors that leads to a realistic path of reduction achievements, then we're not going to succeed in attracting long-term investment.
Cool. Okay. The state of the Federation. The state of the Federation. As you know, when I grew up in Saskatchewan, Western alienation was a hot topic. Mm-hmm. I was, I think, 18 years old when the National Energy Program came out. It was far from the first time in history that it had been a hot topic and has been a topic since. But I need to say to you that my friends back in Saskatchewan tell me that it is qualitatively different now. So that if I'm inclined to look at it and say it's the same old, they say, no, not really. Like, there's something deep that people are really angry right now. Now that's Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan's become a mini version of Alberta, sort of an extension of rural Alberta. But what do you sense about that?
Well, I think, I don't want to compare it to previous incidences of Western or regional alienation because I wasn't there. So I'm not going to be the one that says, oh, it's worse than it was before. I think that's the thing we always tend to say, oh, no, it's way worse. The kids used to be great 50 years ago, but now they're super weird.
The older I get, the more true that is, by the way.
Was that? Yeah.
The older I get, the more true that is. Right?
Yeah, I know, right? But the point is we all have these cycles where, anyway, the point being, I digress. That's not my point. That the issue is that right now, whether it's worse or not as bad or whatever, there is a genuine sense of disconnect and a genuine sense that there's a lack of agency on the part of people in Alberta relative to the rest of the country, and Alberta and Western Canada. I mean, I've lived in BC. The dynamic is I'm sure you've been around BC. In BC, not to be too simplistic about it, everybody east of the Lower Mainland basically thinks like the folks in Alberta do, and everybody from the Lower Mainland down doesn't care about the rest of the country. They're barely aware they're part of it, and they really just care less. So when you look at sort of Western Canada, including parts of BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, parts of Manitoba, there is a legitimate a legitimate concern that we're not being heard and appreciated. As a person born and raised in Northern Alberta who spent 3 years going to school in Toronto with a whole bunch of folks from Toronto, I know full well that there is a very central Canadian focus that lives in central Canada. And as a lefty, I would feel a certain amount of Western alienation and a great deal of pride for my part of the country and a desire to have people understand what they were missing about my part of the country. And I think that's real.
Yeah, nothing makes me a separatist quicker than hearing an Ontarian talk about a Western Canada.
Right. So that is a real thing. And the other thing that's a real thing is that, as I said earlier on in this interview, is that Albertans have gone through a genuinely disruptive time already in terms of their economic security and their hopes for the future. So you put those two things together, and then everybody across the country obviously is struggling post-COVID and this, all that stuff.
Right.
So that's real. I, rather than reveling in the division, though, I think there is an opportunity to remind people what they like about Canada. And that is the thing that is just a choice. You can get up in the morning and you're either angry or you're going to choose to try to find something good about the day. I think that sort of applies to some degree in politics as well. And, when you poll Albertans, the majority of Albertans still describe themselves as Canadians first. Mm-hmm. Maybe not as many as in other parts of the country, but still the majority of Albertans still do that. And they care very much about being part of this country because they believe it to be an amazing country. And there are certain things that still unite us. We just finished talking at some great length about healthcare, and I believe that continues to be a thing that unites us, but not just that. And, there are many, many people. I was talking about how diverse Alberta is and how diverse, Calgary is. They came to Alberta not to separate from Canada. They came to Alberta to be part of Canada. And they understood that Calgary gave them a tremendous opportunity to live a very prosperous life as part of Canada and to be a Canadian. And so I want to focus on reminding people about that, and at the same time, where necessary, putting my elbows up in a pretty, short person aggro kind of way, to make sure that Albertans are heard in Ottawa, and to make sure that our perspective is understood around the table. And I will do that, as a provincial premier relative to the federal government. I'll do that as an Alberta New Democrat relative to New Democrats in Ottawa. I'll do that as a, Albertan who was going to law school in Toronto, that's a lot that I've said now. So maybe you want to ask me another question because I keep talking for a long time.
No, these are great answers. I love them. Thank you. But as you were talking, it occurred to me, that feels reasonable to me for an Albertan or a Saskatchewanian who faces the great uncertainty of the energy transition and what that will mean for their province. And opportunities in their province, it's reasonable for those people to be unnerved by the fact that they don't believe they've got a federal government that is spending much time thinking about them or how to help them or how to and do that. And what could Mr. Trudeau do to put a better foot forward in Alberta? So, what would you say about a public policy that could result in up to 115,000 Canadian workers getting a chance to own the companies they work for, to share in the wealth building that, right now, goes to their owners, and that all this can be done without those employees having to pay for their ownership because the payment would come from the company's future profits? Sounds too good to be real? Well, this is a policy that already exists in the US and UK, Herle Burly-ites. In the US, 14 million American workers currently share $1.7 trillion in wealth through a policy called employee ownership trusts. In the UK, a record 300 businesses were sold to employees in 2021 alone. Some frontline workers have retired as millionaires because of it. Here in Canada, A majority of business owners are planning on selling their businesses over the next 10 years. Many of them would prefer to sell to the employees who made their businesses successful. But unlike the UK and the US, Canadian law and tax policies don't provide a simple way to do it. The Canadian government has committed to bringing employee ownership trust to this country, hopefully in this upcoming budget. If it happens, those 115,000 Canadian workers could accumulate collective personal wealth of almost $10 billion over 8 years. It's a big opportunity, one that requires creating incentives through the tax system for owners to get a fair return in selling to employees, and for all employees of a company to be able to participate in ownership. Those have been the keys to success in the US and UK. Without those incentives that government would get back in taxes over time, this policy will not work. The Canadian Employee Ownership Coalition, a network of business, nonprofit, and charity sector leaders, wants to unlock the massive potential of employee ownership here in Canada. Budget 2023 is the time to do it. To learn more, go to employee-ownership.ca.
In terms of a federal government that wants to convince Albertans that they're on their side, I think it's really important, obviously, be there for them on healthcare, and we've talked about that already, and then to support the work that's going on, that has to go on within our energy industry, to reduce emissions while, as I said, maintaining and growing jobs. I think, those are critical points. I think, the federal government did buy a pipeline. We're going to have the first pipeline to Tidewater in 50 years, under this government. And, that's not nothing. If I were them, I might remind folks of that every now and then. But, at the end of the day, I think that if people are feeling better about our economic prospects, and they're not feeling like a bunch of folks who don't get this province are making economic decisions on their behalf while they're not at the table, then I think things will get better. But I mean, we've definitely seen, I've spoken out against, C-69, as did folks on the far right of the spectrum in Alberta, because it seemed like a lot of decisions were being made that had significant impacts on this province, without us being fully engaged and without people responding to it. And so I think there needs to be some movement on that. And I think that there needs to be support for the work that needs to be done to maintain the viability of an industry that, quite frankly, drives economic prosperity across this whole country, not just in Alberta.
Oh, Jesus. I mean, it's the reason our dollar is worth more than 50 cents.
Yeah.
Okay. We're running out of time, so let's talk some down and dirty politics, former Premier. You ready to talk some down and dirty politics?
Yeah.
All right, so I read the polls. Janet Brown is a friend of mine, and I read the polls, and it looks to me like it's coming down to a fight for Calgary. NDP very strong in Edmonton, UCP very strong in the rural areas, Calgary a dogfight. Let me ask you first, perhaps a little bigger question. Why do you think that rural residents all across Canada, and in fact all across North America, and maybe more broadly than that if I took the time to learn it, but certainly all across North America, rural residents vote Conservative?
Yeah, it's kind of a bit of a poli-sci question, I guess. I think there's probably a lot of different theories out there. I think that it's not, of course, universal, because I can point to rural communities that do not vote Conservative, that have elected members from other party, including even the NDP. Certainly, I grew up in rural Alberta, and my dad was a rural NDP politician throughout his whole career. I think it comes down to feeling like they're included and feeling that they're not being talked down to by folks in other parts of the community that are making decisions on their behalf. And I suppose that if you don't trust the folks making decisions, you're more likely to vote in favor of small government, even if that doesn't equate to good government. But
That's
maybe that's part
interesting.
of it.
That is
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Hadn't thought of that. Okay, so it comes down to Calgary. What's the pitch to Calgary from you?
Well, I mean, my pitch to Calgary, not unlike my pitch to all Albertans, is going to be: listen, we are focused on ensuring that every Albertan can ultimately get access to a family doctor. We are absolutely committed to ensuring that the government is focused every day on how to make life more affordable, and that we are very committed to growing the economy in a way that ensures people have long-term security and hope for the future. So that's the high level, and I think those are the priorities that Calgarians have. That's what we're hearing from them on. The other thing that we hear maybe a little bit more from folks in Calgary on than maybe other parts of the province is education. They're very worried about having an education system that will equip their kids to be confident participants in not only Alberta's economy, but an international economy. And so folks want to know that our public education system is going to be there for them. So those are some of the key pieces that I think will drive the conversations that we have.
So those are big issues in any large urban area, mm-hmm. and they're always politically important. But I would suggest to you that you have a brand problem in Alberta. Not you, the Rachel Notley in Calgary. The Rachel Notley brand, very strong. The NDP brand, not so strong. And probably cross-pollinated by the federal NDP positioning on various things that confuses people about that. I think of Calgary as a very business-focused city. I think of Calgary as a very entrepreneurial city. I think of Calgary as a city with more American influence in it than almost any other city in Canada has. And I think the NDP brand's got to be tough there. And how are you going to convince Calgarians that they can trust you fundamentally with the economy?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think there's a few things in your assumptions there. First of all, I would
take them on. Take them on.
So there's different things there. I mean, you're absolutely right. We do have to present not only a credible but an effective plan for the economy to the business community here in Calgary and across Alberta. I was really pleased with the opportunity to address Calgary's Chamber of Commerce right before Christmas, where I rolled out our economic strategy that was focused on ensuring that we had the most competitive tax structure, ensuring I rolled out a new, quite an ambitious tax credit for new and emerging businesses and a number of other elements, I suppose 5 or 6 elements to it. I won't go through the whole thing, but right. I was pleased because it was well received by a lot of folks in the business community. And it was at a time that our premier was rambling on about, COVID denial and the Sovereignty Act. So, I was pleased to get pretty warm reception there. So we'll continue to remind folks about that and continue to connect. The other thing, though, in Calgary as well, you talk about the brand and all that other kind of stuff. We've got some great candidates. And all but one of our candidates are nominated. Many of them have been nominated for more than 2 years now. We are out door knocking like nobody's business. People are actually meeting their NDP candidates. We our metrics in Calgary, like the sort of numbers of people we've contacted, the number of supporters we've had. We have 10 times the number of supporters today, February 14th, 2023, that we had on February 14th, 2019. Just going at 10 times the number of supporters identified. Awesome. So that is a function of the fact that we have been very focused on getting our candidates out there and doing the hard work of talking to people. And this is my own experience, David, coming from a member of a caucus of 2 in Edmonton, where everyone thought, oh, you're only going to ever win 2 seats in Edmonton and everybody else belongs to other people. And we just, started getting our candidates out on the door, connecting with them in their communities, and actually building relationships with voters, and talking to voters about what their priorities are, but also introducing voters to the idea of, oh, here's my friendly neighborhood NDP candidate who actually knows this person that I know and is not some weird flaky person that, has been, that is a caricature of someone described on the internet.
Right.
And so familiarity and connection is, to me, that's really important politics. I learned that when I was about 6, and that really matters. And we've been doing a lot of that work in Calgary. So that, and then when we talk to people, what are we talking to them about? Healthcare, affordability, growing the economy in a responsible way, making sure that their kids have a good future, both in K-12 and as well as in post-secondary. And it's working.
Tremendous. Ms. Notley, I can't thank you enough for this. It was really interesting. It was a great conversation. Right. And you're fun.
Well, I'm glad. I sometimes I can be funny, but I feel I haven't really done that much this time. It's because I wasn't swearing is the problem.
That is part of the problem. And, when you get dropped an opener like, let's talk about the state of the Federation, it doesn't lead to great humor. I didn't give you much of a setup line. I really appreciate you. You're out there, obviously, making your numbers grow by 10 times. You're very busy. So I appreciate you taking the time, and I wish you the very best of good luck in the future.
Thank you very much. It was a really enjoyable conversation. I'm sure we'll do it again.
Great. I look forward to that. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, our sponsor, CN Rail, and everybody who watched or listened to the show. And of course, I'd very much like to thank Rachel Notley for being on the Herle Burly this week. We'll be back next week with more of it. See you then.